Nobody paid him much mind at first. Just a dusty old pickup coughing onto the runway, rattling louder than the Florida heat, and a man in worn boots stepping onto the tarmac like he belonged to a different time. Clayton Reese wasn't what anyone expected when the call went out for an urgent jet repair. Grease-streaked hands, a threadbare flannel clinging to his frame, and a quiet kind of steadiness that didn't ask for attention. Behind the glass walls of the terminal, executives laughed into their coffee cups, their polished shoes and tailored suits a sharp contrast to the man walking toward their billion-dollar aircraft. But one pair of eyes didn't join in. Delaney Carter, owner of the jet and the Carter Skytech empire, watched in stillness, sensing something no one else could see. Within minutes, she'd change both their lives forever with a question the world would never forget. And so it began, on a morning thick with possibility. It was just shy of 7 a.m. when Clayton pulled onto the tarmac at Clearwater International Airport. The early sky hung low and heavy, bruised in shades of purple and steel. A salty wind off the Gulf whipped against his battered flannel, cutting through him with the sharpness only Florida mornings could manage. His boots crunched across the concrete, each step echoing louder than the distant hum of engines waking up for the day. The call had come before sunrise. Urgent jet failure, no details, no backup, just a location and the promise of quick pay. Clayton had barely finished his black coffee before jumping into his truck, toolbox rattling in the back like loose bones. Now, as he approached the sleek silver giant crouched on the runway, he could feel the weight of 100 stares pressing down on him. The men in navy suits and glossy shoes barely looked up. One executive leaned toward another, muttered something, and they both chuckled, their laughter muffled by the thick glass. Clayton ignored them. He had seen their kind too many times before. Men who could pilot boardrooms but couldn't tell a carburetor from a coffee pot. What mattered was the machine. And today, maybe more than that, what mattered were the lives that depended on it. Dropping his tools with a metallic clatter beside the jet, Clayton popped the engine panel and froze. His breath hitched in his throat. The fuel line wasn't just cracked, it was melted. The insulation had disappeared, leaving scorched metal exposed like a nerve. The clamp that should have secured it had corroded to a sickly green crumble. Even worse, the damaged line sagged perilously close to the ignition coil. One stray spark, and the entire jet could have erupted midair. His stomach turned. Whoever had last worked on this engine should have been banned from ever touching an aircraft again. There was no time to file a report, no time for second opinions. Clayton rolled up his sleeves, wiped sweat from his brow, and got to work. His fingers moved with a certainty honed by years spent fixing tractors in Carolina summers, patching up engines on broken highways and tuning up small planes under a relentless sun. Inside the terminal, Delaney Carter leaned forward, her palms pressed against the glass. Her staff snickered behind her, but she didn't hear them. She saw something they didn't. The precision, the patience, the surety of a man who understood machines the way a maestro understood a symphony. Outside, the jet flickered. A soft hum stirred in the air, faint at first, then stronger, steadier. Delaney's breath caught. He had done it. And before another minute passed, she would walk onto that runway and change both of their lives forever. The hum of the engine grew stronger, like a heartbeat returning after a close call. Behind the tall glass walls of the terminal, the laughter died. The polished men in navy suits stopped mid-conversation, their smirks slipping away as they watched the silver jet come back to life under the hands of the man they had dismissed as a nobody. One of them muttered, "That should have taken hours." But the words felt hollow, useless. Clayton didn't acknowledge their stares. He didn't wait for applause or thanks. He simply wiped his hands on an old oil-stained rag, closed the engine panel with a heavy click, and hoisted his battered tool bag over his shoulder. His job was done. He turned to leave, ready to disappear as quietly as he had arrived. Then, with a soft mechanical whir, the private jet's door opened. The metal steps descended slowly, each latch snapping into place with a sound that cracked the tense silence across the tarmac. Every head turned. A pair of sleek black heels tapped down the steps, and then she appeared. Delaney Carter. She wasn't just another heiress playing CEO. No, she carried herself like someone born into legacy, but shaped by fire. Her tailored navy suit clung to her frame, gold buttons catching the morning sun, her hair pulled back in a sleek, no-nonsense knot. But it was her eyes, sharp, unwavering, that froze Clayton mid-step. She didn't rush. She didn't falter. Delaney walked right past the suits, past the engineers who'd been snickering behind their lattes, past the staff who had written him off at first glance. Every step she took echoed like a drumbeat against the concrete. Clayton stood still, dust rising around his boots. Delaney stopped in front of him, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of her perfume. Something clean, like fresh rain on asphalt. "You fixed it," she said quietly, her voice softer than he expected but carrying an authority that commanded attention. Clayton blinked once. "Yes, ma'am." "You didn't just fix it," she said, searching his face. "You saved it. My pilot said the damage was beyond repair. He missed a melted fuel line." He shrugged slightly, brushing the dust from his shirt. It was almost touching the ignition coil. Her jaw tightened. Not with anger, but something else. Recognition, maybe. "You could have walked away," she said. "I don't walk away from fire hazards," Clayton replied simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. A beat of silence passed between them. Then Delaney smiled. Not the kind of polished practice smile you wear in boardrooms. No, this smile was real. Unpolished. It made her look younger, fiercer, human. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," he said without hesitation. "Delaney Carter, Carter Skytech." "You don't seem impressed." "I'm not here to be impressed. I'm here to fix problems." The words landed between them like a quiet promise. For the first time all morning, the suits inside the terminal stopped pretending. They pressed against the glass, straining to hear, watching something happen that none of them could control. And then Delaney turned toward her staff. "Everyone inside," she said. No one dared argue. The terminal doors clicked shut. Only 2 people remained under the rising sun. The tarmac stretched out around them, wide and empty, the morning sun burning off the last traces of mist. With the terminal doors sealed behind them, it felt like the world had shrunk down to just Clayton and Delaney. She took a breath. Slower this time, like she was tasting the moment. "I've spent my whole life surrounded by men who talk big and do little," Delaney said, her voice softer now, touched with something raw and unguarded. "You're the first one who did the opposite." Clayton shifted slightly, uncomfortable with praise. Just doing my job, ma'am. Delaney tilted her head, studying him the way someone might study a map to a place they'd only ever dreamed of going. Then she did something that made Clayton's heart hitch without warning. She took a step closer. The sunlight caught the tiny flecks of gold in her hair, the wind tugging a few strands loose from her tight bun. For a second, she didn't look like the iron-willed CEO he'd seen on magazine covers. She just looked like a woman standing at the edge of something terrifying and beautiful. "What would you do," she asked slowly, "if someone like me asked you something completely insane?" Clayton didn't move. His boots stayed planted firmly on the concrete. "Depends," he said, voice even. "How insane we talkin'?" Delaney's eyes locked onto his, unwavering. "What if I asked you to marry me?" The world seemed to stop spinning. The wind forgot to blow. The plains in the distance were just silent shapes against the brightening sky. Somewhere a seagull cried high and lonesome. But here, between the two of them, it was dead quiet. Clayton didn't laugh. He didn't smirk. He didn't treat it like a punchline. Instead, he looked at her, really looked at her, as if peeling back all the layers she wore like armor. Delaney waited, every muscle in her body taut with tension she could barely hide. She wasn't a woman used to waiting for answers, but today she stood still. Clayton wiped the sweat off his brow with the back of his hand, streaking a fresh line of grease across his forehead. "You don't even know me," he said, not unkindly. Delaney's voice caught in her throat. "That's why I'm asking." He raised an eyebrow. "Come again?" Delaney stepped closer until the toes of her bare heels almost touched the dusty tips of his boots. She looked up at him, her voice low and urgent. "I've been proposed to 23 times, she said, "by men who memorized my net worth and called it love. But you walked onto this runway, risked your life for a machine you didn't even know belonged to me. You didn't do it for credit. You didn't even look for thanks." "I didn't do it for you," Clayton said almost apologetically. "I did it because someone had to." "Exactly," she whispered. That one word, soft, certain, hung in the space between them like a bridge only they could see. Clayton looked down at his hands, scarred, grease-stained, worn from a lifetime of work no one ever celebrated, and then back at her. Everything about Delaney Carter screamed a world he didn't belong to. Private jets, champagne boardrooms, gala nights under crystal chandeliers. And yet, she was standing there barefoot on the concrete, asking him something that sounded impossible. "You want to marry a mechanic?" he asked, his voice low. "No," Delaney said, a slow smile breaking through like sunrise after a storm. "I want to marry the only man here who didn't try to impress me." Behind the glass walls of the terminal, the suits watched, phones pressed to the glass, cameras flashing like tiny, desperate lightning bolts. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. But Delaney didn't notice. She didn't care. For once, she wasn't performing, she was just being. Clayton scratched the back of his neck, his heart thudding a slow, steady beat inside his chest. Everything inside him told him to be cautious, to doubt it, to walk away from something that didn't make sense on paper. But nothing about Delaney Carter felt fake. Not her voice, not her eyes. And he'd spent enough years fixing what others had given up on to know when something was real. "You serious?" he asked finally, voice rough with disbelief. "As a heart attack," she said without hesitation. For a long moment he just looked at her, weighing something heavy inside him. Then he said quietly, "If you're serious, take off your heels." Delaney blinked. "What?" "If you're serious," he repeated, "take off your shoes. Come walk with me. 5 minutes. No titles, no headlines, just you and me." For a heartbeat, Delaney hesitated. The kind of hesitation born not from fear, but from shedding years of armor she hadn't even realized she wore. Then, without another word, she shifted her weight to one foot and kicked off one heel. Then the other. The click of them hitting the tarmac sounded louder than any applause. Barefoot on the sun-warmed concrete, Delaney Carter followed Clayton Reese without asking where he was leading. They walked side by side past the gleaming jet she had built her empire on, past the silent staff who once whispered behind glass. Delaney didn't look back. She only matched Clayton's pace, step for step, letting the hot concrete sting her feet, grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in years. Clayton led her toward the edge of the airfield where old hangars stood, half forgotten and weather-beaten by time. And for the first time in her life, Delaney Carter wasn't leading. She was following her heart, barefoot into the unknown. The hangar loomed ahead, a relic from another era. Its corrugated metal sides were rusted and sun-bleached, the heavy door hanging slightly off its hinges. It was the kind of place most people would have driven past without a second glance. But Clayton stopped at the threshold and pushed the door open with a screech that cut through the humid morning air. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through dirty skylights and slats where the roof had begun to sag. Dust hung in the air, catching in the shafts of sunlight like flecks of gold. Against one wall stood a battered folding table and a single metal chair. Along the opposite side, photographs were tacked up, some curling at the edges, others taped hastily where the walls had splintered. Planes, engines, mechanics bent over open hoods, and in the center of it all, one small boy in denim overalls grinning up at a man who looked almost exactly like Clayton, only younger and full of life. "My father built his life here," Clayton said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "He used to fix planes everyone else said were too far gone. When he passed, I inherited this hangar, and all the dreams that came with it." Delaney turned slowly, taking it all in. There were no gleaming conference tables here, no gold nameplates, just history, sweat, grit. Every inch of this place told a story. Clayton stepped forward, his boots scuffing the cracked concrete. "Every man you've ever met wanted your empire," he said, his voice steady. "Your name, your money, your world." He looked at her with eyes that didn't ask for anything. "I don't care about any of that." Delaney felt something catch in her chest, sharp and sweet at the same time. "I'm not gonna promise you champagne toasts and red carpets," Clayton continued. "I can promise scraped knuckles, midnight repairs, and dinners eaten off a toolbox." Delaney's lips curved into the kind of smile that felt like breathing for the first time. "That," she said, voice thick with emotion, "sounds perfect." And for the first time since they met, Clayton smiled back. Not a polite smile, not the careful smile you give a woman with $1 billion name, but a real one, wide, unguarded, and a little crooked. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose metal on the roof. But inside the hangar, everything held still. Two people, one broken-down building, a future unwritten. No titles, no brands, no legacies looming. Just a man who knew how to fix what others gave up on. and a woman brave enough to walk barefoot toward the unknown. By morning, the world outside had moved on, spinning in its usual frantic way. But inside the forgotten hangar, time had slowed to a crawl. Sunlight poured through the cracked skylights in soft streams, turning the dust in the air into glittering gold. It was the kind of light that made everything look tender and a little bit sacred. Delaney Carter sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor, barefoot, wrapped in an oversized flannel shirt that swallowed her petite frame. Beside her, neatly folded, lay her designer dress, the last armor she'd worn from her old world. In her hands, she cupped a chipped coffee mug, steam curling upward into the cool morning air. She looked nothing like the billionaire who had just yesterday commanded boardrooms and pilots and empires. She just looked happy, untouched, real. Across from her, Clayton Reese tightened the last bolt on a dusty Cessna he'd been restoring for years. He worked with a wrench in one hand and a half-eaten biscuit balanced precariously on the toolbox beside him. "You really stayed," he said, his voice rough from sleep and black coffee. Delaney smiled into her mug. "I said I would." Clayton chuckled under his breath. "Most people would have called a driver, hopped a ride to the nearest five-star suite. I already know what 5 stars feel like," she said, lifting her gaze to meet his. "I wanted to see what 5 a.m. with you felt like." He barked a soft, surprised laugh, a sound more genuine than anything she'd heard in years. "It's loud. It smells like grease. Starts with black coffee and cold feet," he said, nodding toward her bare toes curled against the concrete. She lifted her mug in a lazy mock toast. "To cold feet, then." Outside the hangar doors, the world was beginning to stir. Engines roared to life, gulls called to each other overhead, and the first whispers of news buzzed through the town. Somewhere, reporters were scrambling, trying to find the billionaire heiress who had vanished off the radar without so much as a press release. Security footage had leaked, blurry images of Delaney Carter walking barefoot across a runway beside a man in torn jeans. Speculation was rampant. The Carter Skytech board was in full meltdown. And in the corporate tower back in Atlanta, Jason Pennington, Delaney's longtime advisor and the architect of much of her public image, was pacing the length of a boardroom, red-faced and furious. "This is unacceptable," he snapped, slamming his palm on the polished mahogany table. "We have journalists camping outside, shareholders panicking, emergency meetings scheduled across 3 continents. A younger executive cleared his throat cautiously. "Sir, what if she's just choosing love?" Jason scoffed, nearly choking on the words. "She's a Carter. Carters don't chase love, they build legacies." But down the table, an older woman, Delaney's godmother, Evelyn, sipped her tea with a rare, knowing smile. Because for once, Delaney wasn't building someone else's legacy. She was finally building her own. Back at the hangar, time had its own slow rhythm. Clayton and Delaney worked side by side, the morning slipping into afternoon without fanfare. There were no board meetings here, no urgent phone calls, no flashing headlines. Only the quiet clink of tools, the scratch of a wrench against rusted metal, and the low hum of 2 people discovering each other without the world watching. Delaney's hands once used only for signing deals worth millions, were now smudged with grease. She wiped her brow with the sleeve of Clayton's flannel, laughing when a smudge of oil streaked across her cheek. Clayton glanced at her from under the wing of the old Cessna and couldn't help the small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. She didn't complain about the dirt. She didn't shy away from the roughness of it all. If anything, she seemed to bloom under it. By late afternoon, the sun hung low, painting the sky in deep oranges and fading blues. The hangar's shadows stretched long across the cracked floor. It was then that Clayton spotted the black SUV pulling up to the airfield gates, its sleek body gleaming like an intruder in this dusty world. He stiffened instinctively, setting down his wrench. Delaney followed his gaze, her smile faltering. She knew that car. Jason Pennington stepped out, adjusting his suit jacket with practiced precision. He moved like a man stepping into a courtroom, not an old hangar. His expression a careful mix of relief and irritated. Jason Pennington stepped out, adjusting his suit jacket with practiced precision. He moved like a man stepping into a courtroom, not an old hangar. His expression a careful mix of relief and irritation. "Miss Carter," he said formally, glancing around with barely concealed disdain. "I'm relieved to find you safe." Delaney straightened slowly, wiping her hands on a rag tucked into the waistband of her borrowed flannel. "What brings you here, Jason?" she asked lightly, though there was a new steel in her voice. "You have the world panicking," he said, stepping closer. "Your jet missed its scheduled departure. Shareholders are in uproar. The media is having a field day. I'm here to escort you back to reality." Delaney smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You mean your version of reality?" Jason's gaze flicked toward Clayton, lingering with thinly veiled contempt. "And who, may I ask, is he?" Clayton, unfazed, wiped his hands on a rag and stepped forward, meeting Jason's stare with calm steadiness. "Just the guy who kept her jet from blowing sky high," he said. Jason gave a tight, humorless chuckle. "Right. And now you think that qualifies you to stand next to her?" Delaney's voice cut through the tension, sharp and clear. "I don't need qualifications to choose who I stand next to," she said. Jason's face darkened, but before he could respond, Delaney stepped closer to Clayton. "Come with me," she said, her voice soft but sure. "Where?" Clayton asked, his hand hesitating. "To show the world," she answered, "that I'm not ashamed of the only person who saw me before the brand." For a moment, Clayton searched her face. Then, without a word, he reached out and took her hand. The old hangar doors groaned open, flooding the dim space with blinding afternoon sunlight. Outside, the world was waiting. Cameras clicked like a chorus of firecrackers. Reporters shouted questions over each other. Flashes burst against the backdrop of the airstrip. The scene was chaos. Lenses and microphones and headlines sharpening in real time. Delaney Carter didn't flinch. She didn't bother smoothing her hair or wiping the grease from her face. She didn't adjust the oversized flannel shirt that dwarfed her slim frame. She simply tightened her fingers around Clayton's rough, calloused hand and stepped into the glare of the waiting world. The reporters roared to life. "Miss Carter, is it true you've left Carter Skytech? Are you engaged? Who is he?" Questions flew like arrows, but Delaney moved as if she didn't hear them. She didn't rush. She didn't hide. At her side, Clayton walked with her, boots dusty, hands stained, shoulders squared. He didn't shrink under the scrutiny. He wasn't polished or camera-ready. He was just real. And that was all that mattered. Across the airfield, Jason Pennington sat stiffly inside the black SUV, watching through darkened windows. His jaw clenched, fingers tapping a restless beat against the steering wheel. He had spent years curating Delaney's image, sculpting her into a brand, a dynasty, a bulletproof legacy. And now, in a matter of hours, it was crumbling before his eyes. Jason had warned her, screamed at her over the phone, that she couldn't just throw everything away for some nobody in a flannel shirt. "What about your future?" he'd shouted. "Your legacy?" But Delaney hadn't answered. Because somewhere between the engine grease and the midnight coffee and the worn-out hangar, she had finally found her answer. Her future wasn't a brand. It wasn't a boardroom or a glossy magazine cover. It was the feeling of bare feet on warm concrete. It was laughter that wasn't rehearsed. It was being seen, not as a Carter, not as a billionaire, but as herself. Clayton squeezed her hand once, steady, grounding. "Are you sure?" he asked under his breath, almost drowned out by the roar of cameras. Delaney turned to him, a soft smile lighting her face. She had never been more sure of anything. "I'm sure," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a song only he could hear. The crowd surged forward, flashes popping like fireworks, but Delaney didn't let go. She held tighter, standing tall under the weight of all their expectations and letting them slide right off her shoulders. For the first time in her life, Delaney Carter wasn't walking the path laid out for her. She was making her own. And she was doing it with the only man who had never once asked her to be anyone but herself. The heat from the tarmac radiated upward, wrapping them in shimmering waves as they crossed the runway, still hand in hand. Behind them, the cameras kept flashing, desperate to capture something they couldn't understand. A woman choosing love over legacy. A billionaire shedding her crown for a mechanic's calloused hand. But Delaney didn't look back. At the foot of the gleaming jet, Clayton hesitated, his free hand brushing over the smooth metal skin of the aircraft he had saved. His boots scuffed the steps as they climbed aboard, the doors hissing shut behind them with a heavy final click. Inside it was quiet. The leather seats gleamed. The polished floors reflected the slanting afternoon sun. Everything smelled faintly of jet fuel and new beginnings. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the intercom crackled to life. "Where to, Miss Carter?" the pilot's voice asked, steady but unsure. Delaney looked out the window. The world below was still a swirl of chaos, journalists, investors, headlines that would scream betrayal and insanity by morning. She didn't care. "Wherever life takes us," she said, her voice calm and certain. The engines rumbled beneath their feet, a low, powerful growl like a beast waking from slumber. The jet began to taxi forward, sunlight gleaming off its wings as it turned toward the open sky. Clayton sat across from her, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his face unreadable but his eyes warm. He wasn't polished. He wasn't rich. He didn't carry promises wrapped in gold. But he carried something she had never known she was missing: truth. As the jet gathered speed, pressing them gently back into their seats, Delaney leaned her head against the cool glass and closed her eyes for a brief moment. This wasn't running away. This was running toward something. Toward a life that wasn't built on contracts and mergers and appearances, but on scraped knuckles, cold coffee mornings, and love so fierce it didn't need permission. She opened her eyes as the wheels lifted off the ground. Clear water shrank away beneath them, the hangar just a tiny rusted smudge now, the suits mere dots scrambling without her. The jet soared higher, cutting through the last layers of cloud. Delaney turned her head and found Clayton watching her. Not the way people looked at a billionaire or a CEO, but the way a man looks at a woman when he sees her. Not what she can offer, not what she can give, but her. She smiled then, a real slow smile that reached all the way to her tired soul. This wasn't the end of a legacy. It was the beginning of a life, their life. And for the first time, Delaney Carter didn't need anyone else's permission to be exactly where she was, soaring free hand in hand with the only man who had ever truly seen her. Sometimes life offers us everything we were taught to want: titles, wealth, admiration, and yet we still find ourselves feeling empty like strangers in our own stories. Delaney Carter had spent her whole life building an empire, becoming the woman the world expected her to be. But all it took was a man with oil-stained hands and a heart full of quiet integrity to remind her of something she'd forgotten. Real life isn't lived behind glass walls or measured by net worth. It's found in scraped knuckles, barefoot walks, laughter at sunrise, and moments when you are truly seen, not for what you have, but for who you are. In a world obsessed with appearances, it takes incredible courage to choose authenticity. It takes strength to leave behind everything shiny and perfect in pursuit of something messy and real. But as Delaney learned, the life waiting beyond the polished facade is often far richer and fuller than anything she ever could have imagined. So wherever you are today, whether you're standing in boardrooms or fixing engines under open skies, remember this: the right person will never love you for the empire you've built. They'll love you for the battles you've survived and the soul you've dared to show. If you believe in second chances, real love, and the kind of happiness money can't buy, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear about the moment you chose to follow your heart. Your story matters, and sometimes the greatest adventure begins the moment you dare to step off the beaten path.